Now, we know that the Western European forces, after the fall of slavery or after the emancipation of the enslaved Africans in the Americas and in the Caribbean, shortly after then started to look to what we now call the Commonwealth for a source of wealth. But what we often don't cover is exactly why this happened. Now, the slave revolts at the time of the emancipation of slavery led to widespread fear amongst Western Europeans and European Americans. Jaque Dessalines, who was Toussaint Louverture's fellow general, his massacre of the French on the island of Haiti was a clear example of what enslaved Africans could do if they won the fight for freedom. Now, essentially, Toussaint Louverture was very focused on negotiating with the French and with the other Western European forces. Why? Because he wanted to set up a democracy with fruitful trade with the Western Europeans. So he wanted to defeat them in combat, but as well as that, he wanted to be recognized as their equal, and then after that, trade with them. Jaque Dessalines had another idea, and that was revenge, which is when he massacred every single French individual on the island of Haiti. Fearing a similar massacre of the Englishmen on the island of Jamaica and other British colonies, the English freed the enslaved Africans, but they forced them into an 8-year apprenticeship where they had to work for free. Jamaicans gathered in a church in Falmouth, Jamaica, and buried Shackles in a coffin, chanting "The monster is dead" as the clock struck 12 midnight on July the 31st in 1838, and this marked the end of slavery on the island of Jamaica as we know it. They did try and force an 8-year apprenticeship on them, but the Jamaicans revolted again and that did not go ahead. Further rebellions and uprisings pressured the authorities to disband this new apprenticeship form of slave labour. Jamaicans would have to continue to fight for the disbandment of segregation and other oppressive, more or less apartheid laws for some time after. An example of this is the Morant Bay rebellion led by Paul Bogle, where 25 people died as a result. Now, a combination of moral obligation and economic competition between empires led to 1% of the British Navy being used to police the Atlantic, combating the illegal British and non-British slavers. So essentially, the British Navy, or Britain, dedicated about 1% of the naval forces to trying to stamp out slavery by interrupting the course of ships travelling from West Africa to the Caribbean and to the Americas. However, this is more likely to be due to economic competition than moral or ethical obligation. The British Empire now had to defend its economic supremacy after losing its main source of income, i.e. slavery, selling slave-farmed cotton, which was processed in northern England. And this is really what started to peak the Industrial Revolution. Yes, there was some, mechanical engineering and some very efficient engineering that went on at the time, but what the North was processing was the produce of slave labour. David of Olusoga in Black British tells the story of how Britain aimed to set up exclusive trade deals with African countries. We see this in the Bombardment of Lagos. Now, on December the 26th in 1851, British naval forces bombarded the home of Nigerian chieftains. Previously, the British had attempted to strike a trade deal with Nigeria on the ultimatum that they would stop supplying other European empires with African slaves. The last few hundred years of the transatlantic slave trade had seen the growth of a slave economy in West Africa, which many civilizations were now relying on. And remember how this started. Western European forces essentially forced an arms race by arming weaker tribes and on the outskirts of these big cities to then make the different tribes compete with each other for the purchase of guns by selling their enslaved neighbours. To maintain economic dominance, the British didn't want other European forces to have an economic advantage over them. When OBA KOSOKO, the king of Nigeria, refused to sign a trade deal, the British naval forces sailed up the Niger River and bombarded OBA KOSOKO's palace. The British ousted OBA KOSOKO and installed OBA KOSOKO in his place. Lagos, Nigeria signed a treaty the next year. Now, my task to you is I want you to explore the motives of the British at this point. They took a seemingly positive stance on slavery, however, they were economically motivated in their actions. These actions were often violent and invasive. Were the British in the wrong or the right for their forced occupation of Lagos? Explore both arguments for and against their takeover of Lagos and weigh your discussion with the positives and the negatives. Were they in the right, were they in the wrong? Under your teacher's guidance, feel free to debate. Thanks for watching, and then whenever you've finished conversing and debating, we can then progress on to the next part of the lecture.